300 guests filled the Ferraro estate that night, and every one of them was facing the wrong way. They were watching the champagne towers and the woman in the ivory gown accepting congratulations by the marble staircase. Nobody was watching the woman in the gray cleaning uniform crossing the floor against the current of the entire room. Her name was Delphine Aubry, 27 years old, and she'd scrubbed the floors of that house since spring without one person in it ever asking what she was called. She worked 3 jobs. There was a burn scar running up her left forearm, and she kept her sleeve pulled down over it out of habit. She stopped in front of Elias Ferraro, 34, the man who ran the port of New Orleans without ever raising his voice. The man his people said never gave the same warning twice. He didn't recognize her. He looked down at her the way a man looks at a chair that's been moved. And then she raised that scarred hand to cover her mouth, leaned in close, and whispered 11 words. She meets a man in the old carriage house. Every night, 9:14. Across the room, the bride-to-be turned around with her phone still in her hand, and her face changed. Now, most people hearing this would assume they already know where it's going. A rich man, a beautiful fiancé, a secret meeting after dark. But that assumption is exactly what nearly cost Elias Ferraro everything he had, because what that cleaning woman had seen through a pane of glass wasn't a love affair. It wasn't anything close to one. It was a name she'd seen once before, on a piece of paper she couldn't bring herself to throw away. And before the night was over, he'd throw her out of his house for saying it out loud. If this kind of story hits you where you live, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Now let's head back to that ballroom, because the whisper was only the beginning. 4 weeks before that night, on an ordinary Tuesday evening with nothing memorable about it, Delphine Aubry stepped out of the laundry on Claiborne Avenue, with steam still dampening the shoulders of her shirt. Her shift ended long after darkness had fallen. The owner nodded to her over one shoulder, her eyes still fixed on the press coughing out white steam, and Delphine nodded back. They had said goodbye to each other that way for 2 years, without ever exchanging more than 10 sentences. She stepped outside, and the humid New Orleans heat settled over her like a wet blanket. She reached down and tugged her left sleeve lower, covering her forearm completely, a gesture she had repeated so often that she no longer noticed herself doing it. The walk from the laundry to her room took 25 minutes. She had calculated that if she walked instead of taking the bus, she could save enough each week to buy a pack of batteries for her daughter's hearing aid. So she walked. She walked past the low houses of the 9th Ward, past porches where people sat fanning themselves by hand, past the crackling sound of music coming from a radio someone had left outside a doorway. The room she rented was above a tire repair shop, reached by an iron staircase bolted to the outside wall, and every time she climbed it, the whole staircase gave a long creak, as though it were sighing. But she never went upstairs first. She never had. She turned instead toward the screen door on the ground floor, knocked twice, then opened it, and in Odette Boudreau's kitchen, the lamp over the table was still burning. Odette was 68 years old, and had worked as a cook in a downtown restaurant for nearly 30 years, before her knees forced her to stop. She had been a friend of Aaron's mother since the days when both of them lived down near Homa, and when Delphine moved here carrying a small child in her arms, Odette hadn't asked a single question. She had simply opened the door and said there was an empty bed in the back room. Odette rose slowly from her chair and made the familiar gesture of pointing toward the bedroom, then lifting one finger to her lips. Josie was asleep. The little girl slept there every night her mother worked the evening shift, on a small bed beside the window, beneath her own blanket printed with blue whales that Odette had bought at a flea market, with a shell-shaped nightlight plugged into the outlet near the floor, because she liked watching her shadow on the wall before closing her eyes. Her school bag rested on the chair beside the bed, already packed for the morning. Odette always packed it. Delphine went inside, knelt beside the bed, and placed her palm gently against her daughter's chest. Josie had been born deaf, so that was how her mother told her she was home. The little girl didn't wake. She only stirred faintly, and the small hands curled beneath her chin slowly relaxed. Delphine stayed that way for a while, long enough to count 3 of her daughter's breaths, then stood. Back in the kitchen, Odette had already placed a plate of cold rice on the table beneath a cloth, along with an envelope. She said nothing about the envelope. She only pushed it across the table with 2 fingers, then turned away to pour a glass of water, the way people do when they already know what kind of news is inside and don't want to watch the face of the person receiving it. Delphine opened it. It was a letter from the hospital, printed on good paper, with a scanned signature at the bottom. Josie's cochlear implant surgery had been postponed again. This time they wrote that the funded placement had been given to another patient on the waiting list, and that the family could apply again during the next review period. Delphine read the entire letter once, then read it again more slowly, as though slowing down might somehow persuade the words to change their meaning. Odette set the glass of water in front of her and said what would come, that the little girl was still healthy, that she had spent the whole afternoon laughing. Delphine nodded. She thanked her, folded the letter, and slipped it into her pocket. Then she climbed the iron staircase to her room. The room had only one window, looking out over the metal roof of the tire shop. She didn't turn on the main light. She sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, took off her shoes, and remained there for a long time with the letter still in her pocket, listening to the sounds of cars rising from the street below. Then she knelt down, reached beneath the bed, and pulled out a tin box. It was heavier than it looked. She placed it on her lap, rested her palm on the lid, and held it there. She didn't open it. She hadn't opened it in 2 years. Then she pushed the box back beneath the bed, lay down, and set her alarm for the morning shift. That tin box had followed her all the way from Homa, and everything inside it belonged to the part of her life before she learned how to scrub other people's floors. Back then, Delphine was 21 years old, and Aaron Aubrey built shrimp boats at the yard down by the docks, work that left the smell of machine oil on his hands no matter what kind of soap he used. They married in the fall, and the following summer, Josie was born. They discovered it during the first week at the hospital, with a small machine placed behind the baby's ear. Josie had been born deaf, and the doctor said those words in the gentle voice people use only when they know they are dropping a stone into perfectly still water. Delphine remembered that she didn't cry in the hospital room. She cried alone in the parking lot, wiped her face, then went back inside. Aaron reacted the way Aaron always did. He went home, sat down at the kitchen table, and began to draw. He drew hands. He said that if his daughter couldn't hear, then everyone in that house would have to learn another language, because he wasn't going to let his child grow up in a home where she was the only person who knew how to speak it. So they learned. At first, there were evening classes at St. Bernadette Church once a week with 4 other families. Then came books borrowed from the library, old instructional tapes, and evenings when husband and wife sat facing each other across the kitchen table practicing signs until their wrists ached. But that language solved only half the problem, and it was the other half that pushed Delphine farther. Because children don't begin signing the moment they are born. There was a long stretch of time, from when Josie first learned to sit until she was old enough for those tiny fingers to obey her, when the little girl tried to tell her mother many things in the only way she knew how, by moving her lips. Sometimes no sound came out at all. Sometimes there were sounds, but they had no shape. And Delphine, sitting on the kitchen floor in front of her daughter, began learning how to read them. She learned from guidebooks for parents, then from a retired teacher in Terrebonne whom someone recommended to her, an elderly woman who had taught lip reading for nearly 40 years, and told Delphine in their very first lesson that she needed to abandon the idea that this was some kind of miracle. She explained that most speech sounds looked exactly alike on a person's lips, that some pairs of sounds were impossible to distinguish, and that anyone who claimed to understand an entire sentence with their eyes alone was either lying or guessing. She taught Delphine 3 conditions, and those 3 conditions later became the only things Delphine trusted. Light had to fall on the speaker's face, not from behind them. She had to be close enough to see the person's teeth, not merely the shape of the mouth, and the person had to speak slowly and face her directly, because the moment they turned their head even slightly, everything dissolved into meaninglessness. Outside those 3 conditions, the woman said, Delphine would catch only fragments, and the rest she would have to guess from the flow of the conversation. Delphine guessed wrong many times. She guessed wrong with her own daughter, guessed wrong with store clerks, guessed wrong with people in the evening classes. She was wrong far more often than anyone would ever imagine about someone with that skill, but she was right often enough to understand her child before her child knew how to speak with her hands, and to Delphine, that was enough to make it worthwhile. Aaron used to joke that his wife could hear the things people thought they were hiding. Then one day he stopped joking, and one evening he told her seriously that she should never let anyone know she could do it. He didn't explain why. He simply said it, then turned back to his drawings. Then came the boat, and after the boat came the paper. They borrowed money to buy an old shrimp boat, because building boats for other people for the rest of their lives was never going to be enough. And someone told Aaron that this was how men like him moved upward in the world. Delphine no longer remembered exactly what interest rate had been written on that paper, and she had stopped reading the number a long time ago. She only remembered that it kept growing in a way no one could ever explain to her. The boat was taken away. The debt remained, and Aaron began working 2 shifts, then 3, at the yard during the day, and unloading cargo at night. For 2 straight years, until one September morning, when he sat down on the dock to retie his shoelace and never stood up again. He was 31 years old. People said his heart had simply been working too hard for too long. After the funeral, all Delphine had left in her hands was a 5-year-old daughter, a debt carrying both their names, and that loan document, the one piece of paper she could never bring herself to throw away. That same week, less than 15 minutes by car from the place where Delphine walked home each night, a man named Wendell Pruitt was sitting inside the office at Warehouse 9 at the port, trying to keep both hands still on the desk. He had been sitting there for nearly 40 minutes. No one had told him he had to stay. No one had locked the door. The office door remained open, and beyond it were the docks, the cranes, the sound of ship horns carrying in on waves. He could have stood up and walked away at any moment, but he didn't, because among the people who worked around the port of New Orleans, everyone knew that when Elias Ferraro said he was coming by, the only sensible thing to do was sit there and wait. Elias arrived close to 6 o'clock in the evening. He came in alone. Otis Grady parked outside and remained in the car, as he had done for 20 years. First for Elias's father, and now for Elias himself. Elias didn't shake Wendell's hand. He didn't sit down immediately either. He walked once around the cramped office, looked at the calendar hanging on the wall, looked at the family photograph tucked beneath the glass covering the desk, then finally pulled out a chair and sat across from him. He placed a black leather notebook on the desk, small enough to fit in one hand, the edges of its pages worn yellow from being turned so many times. He didn't open it right away. He asked Wendell about his knee, the one he had undergone surgery on in the spring, and Wendell said it was better, his voice as dry as paper. Elias nodded. Then he opened the notebook. He didn't say a single word about the shipping containers that had been underreported, about the cargo leaving Warehouse 9 through routes that appeared on no paperwork, or about the money flowing into an account under the name of Wendell's brother-in-law in Baton Rouge. He didn't need to mention any of it. They both knew why he was there. Instead, Elias began to read. He read about the year Wendell's mother was hospitalized, where the money for her heart surgery had come from, and whose signature had approved it. He read the name of the school Wendell's oldest daughter attended, and read who had covered her final year of tuition after the plant closed, and Wendell spent 6 months without work. He read about a loan from a pawn shop on Rampart Street, a loan Wendell had forgotten he ever had because it had been erased before he managed to repay a single dollar. Elias read slowly and evenly, without emphasizing a single word, in the voice of a man reading an inventory list. There was no accusation in any line he read. That was what made it frightening. Wendell Pruitt sat there listening to his entire life being read aloud in someone else's voice, and he understood that all those years he had believed those good things were luck, kindness, the sort of blessings that simply fell into the life of a hard-working man. They had never been any of those things. They had been recorded, every one of them. When Elias finished, he closed the notebook and rested one hand on top of it. He told Wendell that he had 2 days to walk out of the port on his own, submit his resignation himself, and tell his wife in whatever words he chose. Then Elias said one more thing, and it was the only sentence that entire evening in which his voice changed. Only slightly, slowing by a single beat. He said that if Elias had to be the one to walk Wendell out of there, then he would take Wendell's name with him. Wendell Pruitt began to cry before Elias could rise from his chair. He cried without sound, his shoulders trembling, both hands still resting on the desk where he had spent the whole afternoon trying to keep them still. Elias didn't look at him. He picked up the notebook, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and walked out. He didn't say another word, and he had no intention of saying one, because in New Orleans, the people who worked around the Ferraro family passed along one thing about that man. Elias never warned anyone twice. He spoke once, in an ordinary voice, and considered the message delivered. If the other person chose not to hear it, that was no longer his concern. His father had used fists, used men, used nights no one wanted to speak about afterward. Elias used none of those things. He only needed to know. Otis opened the car door when he saw Elias coming, and on the drive back, neither man spoke for a long stretch of road. Then Otis glanced into the rearview mirror and asked whether Elias intended to let Wendell keep his pension. Elias looked out the window at the rows of harbor lights sliding backward behind them and said yes. The man had a family. Otis asked nothing more. He had driven for this family long enough to understand that the answer, like everything else about Elias Ferraro, wasn't kindness, and it wasn't cruelty. It was simply one more line entered into the book. Delphine began working at the Ferraro estate in the spring, and on that first night, the person who showed her around was Ruthie Fontenot. Ruthie had been the head housekeeper there for many years, a 54-year-old woman who carried herself straight and whose voice never rose. She didn't bring Delphine in through the front door. She led her around the back, across the stone courtyard, through a small wooden door that opened into the service corridor running behind the kitchen. And along the way, she pointed out each thing one by one, the way someone gives directions through a forest. The east elevator belonged to the family, and no one on the cleaning staff was allowed to press that button. The main staircase was only to be used when someone told them to use it. The library door was never to be opened without permission, not even for cleaning. Ruthie spoke in the voice of someone who had repeated these rules so many times that they were no longer instructions, but something closer to prayer. Then she stopped where the hallway turned, looked Delphine directly in the face, and told her the most important thing. She said that in this house, whenever someone passed by, Delphine was to move against the wall and lower her eyes. Don't look up. Don't look them in the eye. People like us who look people like them in the eye lose their jobs within a week, and no one ever bothers to explain why. Delphine nodded. She wasn't offended. She had lived long enough on the other side of beautiful rooms to understand that Ruthie wasn't teaching her how to make herself small. She was handing her a life jacket, and Delphine had been accustomed to people looking straight through her for so long that she no longer noticed it, just as she no longer noticed herself tugging down her left sleeve. That night, close to 11 o'clock, she was mopping the second-floor hallway when she heard footsteps. She stepped back, moved against the wall, and lowered her face toward the bucket at her feet. Elias Ferraro passed less than 3 feet away, speaking into his telephone as he walked. He didn't slow down. He didn't look toward her. He passed her the way someone passes a coat rack, and the sound of his footsteps faded until it disappeared at the far end of the hallway. Delphine straightened and continued mopping. Near midnight, she moved to a small study in the west wing. The room she had been told belonged to Miss Ashford. A file had been left open on the desk, a thick stack of papers clipped inside a stiff cover, and the desk lamp was still on. Delphine had no intention of reading it. She moved her cleaning cloth around the edge of the desk, and her eyes passed over the heading of the first page the way a person's eyes pass over anything while working. Then she stopped. The name printed at the top of the page was Halcyon Ridge Partners. She had seen that name exactly once in her life, printed on the paper inside the tin box beneath her bed, the paper bearing Aaron's signature on the final line. She stood there with the cloth still in her hand, and she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She didn't take a photograph. She didn't turn the page. She didn't touch the file with a single finger. And at that exact moment, the door opened. Camille Ashford walked in, 31 years old, owner of an art gallery in the French Quarter, the woman for whose wedding the entire house was preparing. She saw Delphine standing beside the desk. She didn't shout. She didn't ask what Delphine was doing there. She smiled, a real smile that reached all the way to her eyes, then closed the door behind her, and came over to sit on the edge of an armchair, as though the two of them were about to have a pleasant conversation. She asked how long Delphine had been working there. Delphine said since the spring. She asked where Delphine lived, and Delphine said the 9th Ward. Camille nodded, and said there was a very good bakery down there. Then she asked whether Delphine had children, and when Delphine said she had a daughter, Camille asked the little girl's name. Delphine hesitated for half a second, then told her. Camille repeated the name once, softly, as though committing it to memory. Then stood, looked around the room, and said the floor looked especially clean that evening, that she truly appreciated it. She wished Delphine good night and left. Not one word in that entire conversation had been unpleasant. Delphine finished cleaning the room, and she dropped the cloth twice. 3 days later, when she returned to clean that room again, the file was no longer on the desk. In its place was another stack of papers, a guest list and flower estimates, left open and neatly arranged in exactly the place where the other file had been. No one ever said anything to her about it. Then one evening, later that week, while Delphine stood in the courtyard pouring dirty water into the drain, she happened to look up. Camille was standing alone on the second-floor balcony, with a telephone pressed to her ear. The wall light fell directly across her face. She had turned fully toward the courtyard, one elbow resting on the railing, and she was speaking very slowly, the way a person speaks when they want to make certain that whoever is listening doesn't misunderstand a single word. Delphine stood about 13 feet away in the darkness, holding the empty bucket, and she read one complete sentence from Camille's lips. After the wedding, not before, his signature has to be the signature of a husband. The Ferraro family council met in the large dining room on the ground floor, on evenings when the entire service staff was sent home early, and Ruthie carried the coffee in herself before leaving. 13 people sat around that long table. Most of them had been sitting there since Elias's father was alive, and half of them were still accustomed to calling him by the name they had used when he was a boy. That night, Elias presented the plan he had spent nearly a year preparing. He used no papers. He stood at the head of the table and said that over the next 5 years, every part of the family's operation would be moved into legitimate business, one piece at a time, beginning with transportation, then warehousing, then restaurants, that every stream of money would pass through books capable of surviving an audit, and that anything that couldn't be converted would be shut down rather than preserved. He said his father's generation had done business in a different city from the city that existed now, and anyone who failed to understand that wouldn't survive the decade. When he finished, he sat down. The room remained silent for a while. Then Emmett Ferraro set down his coffee cup. Emmett was Elias's cousin, 38 years old, tall and easygoing, the kind of man people liked the first time they met him. He stood and began with praise. He said he had never seen anyone in this family think as far ahead as his cousin, that if Uncle Salvatore were still alive he would probably be stunned. He said the plan was beautiful, so beautiful that he had only one small question, and that small question was how the people who had followed this family since their father's time were supposed to live during those 5 years of transition. He named several people sitting around the table. He asked Mr. Bertrand in transportation what would happen to his fleet during the first 18 months. He asked Mrs. Marguerite whether the income from the warehouse division would be enough to cover the difference. He never objected once. He only asked questions, one person after another, in the concerned voice of a man worried about all of them, and by the time he sat down, the atmosphere around the entire table had changed. Mr. Bertrand said perhaps they should review some of the numbers. Mrs. Marguerite said she supported the spirit of the proposal but needed more time. The vote was postponed until the next meeting, and no one in the room said aloud that it had just been buried. One by one, everyone left. Elias remained alone at the head of the table until he realized Emmett hadn't gone. Emmett walked to the liquor cabinet in the corner, poured 2 glasses, brought them back, set one in front of Elias, and pulled out the chair beside him. He said Elias shouldn't be angry, that he had only asked the questions half the table had been too afraid to ask, and that if Elias wanted to win next time, he should talk to him first, because the two of them walking into the room together would be a very different thing. Elias didn't answer. He lifted the glass, but didn't drink. Emmett looked around the room, looked up at the portrait of Elias's father hanging above the fireplace, then gave a short laugh, and said that in any case, his cousin had nothing to complain about when it came to him, because the best thing in Elias's life now was something Emmett had brought him in the first place. Elias asked what he meant. Emmett shrugged, tipped his chin toward the door, and asked who had dragged Elias to that gallery exhibition in the French Quarter several years earlier. He said he really should have demanded a commission. Then he laughed, and Elias laughed too, because that was exactly how the two of them had spoken to each other since they were boys, and because the story had been told so many times within the family that it had become a familiar joke rather than a piece of information. At that exact moment, the door opened. Camille walked in with her car keys still in her hand, her hair damp from the mist outside. She said she was late because she had to close the gallery, then walked around behind Elias's chair, placed both hands on his shoulders, and bent down to kiss his hair. She greeted Emmett. Emmett stood, kissed her on the cheek in the familiar way family members greeted one another, then stepped back and stood there looking at both of them. He said they looked perfect together. He said it in the voice of a man who sincerely meant it, and he smiled, and that smile remained on his face until he picked up his coat and walked out the door. Elias didn't go upstairs that night. After Camille went to bed and the house had fallen completely quiet, he went down to the kitchen, switched on a small light above the sink, and sat on a stool at the corner of the counter. He didn't pour himself anything to drink. He sat there with both hands resting on the cold stone surface, And inside his head, the moment Mr. Bertrand had said that perhaps they should review a few of the numbers kept repeating itself again and again. At 3 o'clock in the morning, there was the faint sound of water moving in the hallway. Delphine was cleaning the stretch of floor that connected the kitchen to the rear hall, the only part of the house that had to be scrubbed by hand because the stone there was old and couldn't withstand a machine. She was on her knees, and when she heard the stool scrape inside the kitchen, she stopped, straightened slightly, and lowered her face. But no footsteps came toward her. For a long while, there was nothing. Then his voice came from beneath the small light, quiet, without the slightest sound of an order. He asked how many places she worked. Delphine looked up for exactly half a second, then lowered her eyes again. She said, 3. She added that she worked at the laundry in the mornings, at the restaurant on weekends, and here at night, then stopped because she realized no one had asked for the rest. The kitchen fell silent again. It remained silent so long that Delphine was about to pick up the cloth and continue cleaning, because she assumed the conversation had ended the way conversations with people in this house usually ended, which was without anyone saying the final sentence. Then he spoke. My mother worked 4 jobs. He said only those words, in the voice of a man who had found something forgotten inside the pocket of an old coat and didn't know why he had taken it out. Delphine didn't answer. She didn't know how. She heard the stool scrape back across the tile, heard footsteps crossing the kitchen, and then he passed her where the hallway turned. He slowed for half a beat, just enough for her to feel it, then continued toward the stairs. He didn't ask her name. The following morning, in the staff room, Delphine was hanging her apron on a hook when Ruthie appeared in the doorway and told her to sit down for a moment. She closed the door. She didn't ask what had happened the night before, and Delphine understood that she already knew, because in this house people knew everything except the names of those who scrubbed the floors. Ruthie sat in the chair across from her, placed both hands in her lap, and said she wanted to tell Delphine something she hadn't told anyone in all these years. She said that long ago, when she was younger than Delphine was now, she worked in another house, on another street, for another family. It was a beautiful house. She worked there for nearly 4 years, and during those 4 years, she saw something. She didn't say what it was. She only said she had seen it many times, enough times that she could no longer tell herself she had misunderstood, and that the person it was happening to was the lady of the house, a woman a few years younger than Ruthie. She said she had thought about speaking. She thought about it for an entire summer. She had rehearsed every sentence in her mind, decided who she would tell, even planned for losing her job and where she would go afterward. Then she said nothing. She said she stayed silent because she was afraid, and she wouldn't stand there now and invent some nobler reason than that. She was afraid of losing her place to live, afraid of losing the wages she sent home to her mother in the country, afraid that the reputation of being a troublesome servant would follow her from one house to the next. She stayed silent, and she kept her job. Then Ruthie said the last thing, and she said it very softly. She said that woman didn't make it through that year. Delphine sat without moving. Ruthie didn't cry, didn't look away, didn't apologize to anyone. She only said she wasn't telling Delphine this story to frighten her, and she wasn't telling her to do anything differently. She said she was telling it so Delphine would understand why, on that first night, Ruthie had taught her to lower her head. She said she knew exactly what she had been giving her. She knew it wasn't wise advice. It was a wound, and she was passing it down to the next person because it was the only thing she had to give, and because she would rather see Delphine keep her head lowered and remain whole. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her dress, and said it was time to open the kitchen. She opened the door and left first. Delphine remained alone in the staff room for a while longer, surrounded by coat hooks and the smell of soap, thinking about the words that man had spoken in the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, a sentence that led nowhere and asked nothing of her. And then she stood, went downstairs to the kitchen, and began her shift. That evening Delphine came home earlier than usual because her shift at the estate ended ahead of time, and when she knocked twice on the screen door at Odette's house, the light in the back room was still on. Odette stood in the kitchen, shook her head, and pointed toward the room with the expression of someone who had just lost an argument. She said the little girl refused to sleep, that she claimed it was Friday so she was allowed to stay up later, and Odette couldn't remember ever agreeing to such a rule. Delphine laughed and went inside. Josie was sitting cross-legged on the bed, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a cape, and the shell-shaped nightlight cast her shadow onto the wall in a round shape 3 times larger than she was. The little girl lifted her hands to greet her mother before Delphine had even reached the bed. Delphine sat on the edge of the mattress and signed for her to lie down, and Josie signed back that Fridays didn't have bedtimes. Delphine signed that Fridays still had bedtimes. They were only half an hour later. Josie thought for a second, then signed that the extra half hour had already ended a long time ago. But because her mother had come home late, her mother's half hour was only beginning now. Delphine opened her mouth as though she might say something, then stopped. The little girl looked at her, and that look lasted longer than it needed to. Then the small hands rose and signed that Mom was worried. Delphine signed that Mom was thinking. Josie signed that those were two different things, and her mother's face was making the worried face, not the thinking face. Delphine sat still for a while. Then she began signing slowly, searching for one word at a time, that there was something at the place where she worked, something she knew, that she wasn't completely certain, that if she told someone about it, she might lose her job. And if she lost that job, things would become difficult for them. When she finished, she looked at her daughter, and she couldn't tell how much of what she had just said had been meant for the child, and how much had been meant for herself. Josie didn't think about it for long the way adults did. She pulled the blanket from her shoulders, sat up straight, and signed with the short, decisive movements of a child, repeating something she had been told many times and believed completely. Dad said knowing something and staying quiet is lying too. Delphine went completely still. She signed that this was different. Josie signed back that Dad said what Dad said, and Dad never said except when it is hard. Then the little girl lay down, pulled the blanket all the way to her chin, and signed goodnight to her mother with the expression of someone who had just brought a meeting to an end. Delphine remained beside the bed for a while longer. She placed her hand on Josie's chest until the breathing beneath her palm settled into an even rhythm, then dimmed the light, said goodnight to Odette, and climbed the iron staircase to her room. She didn't turn on the main light. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, then knelt, reached beneath the bed, and pulled out the tin box. She placed it on her lap. This time, she opened the lid. Resting on top was the loan document folded into quarters, its edges yellow with age. She lifted it out and set it aside. Beneath it, arranged neatly in 2 rows inside the old cloth Aaron had used to line the box, were small recording tapes, the kind used in the handheld recorder he used to carry down to the docks to record water currents and coordinates. 43 tapes. Each one had a small strip of paper attached to the side with a date written in his slanted handwriting. The handwriting, he always joked, looked as ugly as bird tracks. She lightly touched the top row with one finger without picking up a single tape. The last one rested in the upper right corner, and the strip of paper attached to its side had no date on it. Only one handwritten line, "For the day you can hear." Delphine stared at those words for a long time in the faint light spilling in through the window. Then she placed the loan document back on top, closed the lid, and pushed the box beneath the bed again. She had already made Aaron a promise. Josie would be the first person to listen. She lay down in the darkness, and her daughter's hands kept appearing inside her mind, the way they had risen with such certainty and refused to allow anyone to argue, and she remained awake like that for a very long time before finally falling asleep. 3 restaurants stood on Decatur Street, a few blocks apart, and on paper they belonged to the food division Emmett had overseen since Elias's father was still alive. Elias didn't discover the problem by going through their books. He discovered it because for several months, the amount of liquor being delivered to those 3 places didn't match the number of people sitting in their dining rooms, and because the same supplier name appeared 3 times at 3 different locations, even though no one in the business seemed to know who that supplier was. He didn't ask Emmett. He didn't send anyone down to inspect the restaurants. On Thursday afternoon, he made 3 telephone calls. The first was to a woman in Metairie whose family had held the first property for 3 generations. The second was to a small investment fund in Houston that wanted out of the Louisiana market. The third was to his own attorney. Before nightfall, the leases on all 3 properties had changed hands, and the person named as landlord was now no one other than Elias himself. He called Emmett to the library close to 7 o'clock. Emmett arrived wearing the expression of a man who was busy and perfectly happy to interrupt that busyness for his cousin. He sat down, asked what was going on, and Elias didn't answer that question. He simply pushed 3 sets of keys across the table, each one tied to a small piece of paper bearing the name of a street. Emmett looked down. He didn't touch them. The smile on his face didn't disappear. It merely stopped moving, like a clock that had suddenly quit running while the hands remained exactly where they were. Elias told him the kitchens were still his. The menus were still his. The employees would still call him boss. He still got to keep the restaurants. He simply didn't get to keep the doors anymore. When Elias finished, he sat in silence and said nothing else, because he never repeated himself a second time. Emmett remained there for a while. Then he picked up the nearest set of keys, gave them a light shake so they made a single sound, and set them back down. He raised his eyes to Elias, and he laughed. Not an awkward laugh, not a bitter one, but the easy laugh of a man who had just watched a beautiful move on a chessboard and sincerely admired it. He stood, gave his cousin one pat on the shoulder, and walked out. That evening there were guests in the large sitting room. Several of Camille's friends from the gallery, a married couple who worked in event planning, and Elias, standing near the fireplace with a glass of wine he hadn't touched. Delphine was clearing things away in the corner, stacking empty glasses onto a tray, and moving along the wall the way she always did. Camille stood about 2 steps away, holding a glass of wine and speaking with the woman who planned events, laughing at something that had just been said. Then she turned to reach for something on the cabinet. Her elbow struck the edge of her own tray. The glass slipped from her hand, fell onto the stone floor, and broke with one sharp, clean sound that silenced the entire room. Camille stepped back, looked down at the red wine spreading across the floor, then raised her head and said, in the gentle voice of someone trying not to make a scene, that it was all right. The woman had bumped into her. She probably didn't see her. Delphine was standing nearly 5 feet away with the tray in her hands. She hadn't touched anyone. Elias stood near the fireplace, and he had seen everything. He had seen Camille's elbow strike the tray. He had seen the distance between the two women. He had seen the glass leave Camille's hand before it hit the floor. He stood there with the wine glass still in his hand, and he said nothing. The woman who planned events said, "Oh goodness, be careful not to cut yourself." Someone laughed. The conversation in the room resumed, one beat slower at first, then returned to normal. Delphine set down the tray, knelt on the stone floor, and began picking up the broken pieces with 2 fingers, placing them carefully into the palm of her other hand. She gathered every piece, even the smallest ones, because the smallest pieces were the ones people stepped on. Then she took a cloth and blotted the red wine from the floor. When she finished, she looked up. She hadn't meant to. She only raised her head because she needed to stand. And in that half second, her eyes met his. He was looking at her. He had been looking at her the entire time, and he was the one who looked away first. He turned toward the fireplace, lifted his glass, took a sip of wine, and told the man standing beside him that it looked as though it might rain outside. After that night, Delphine began paying attention to the time, and she paid attention the way someone does when she has grown accustomed to remembering everything she isn't allowed to write down. Camille left the sitting room sometime after 9 o'clock. Not exactly 9. Not 9:30. Delphine looked at the clock hanging in the kitchen the first time out of curiosity, the second time because she didn't believe it, and by the third time, she stood there, watching the second hand move, and understood that the woman left the house at 9:14 every night, with a consistency that felt less like a habit than an appointment. Camille didn't use the front door. She went out through the west side entrance, the door that opened onto a gravel path running beside the row of orange trees planted along the wall, and that path led to the old carriage house hidden in the far corner of the garden, the carriage house Delphine had never seen anyone use since she started working there. The following Tuesday night, after she emptied the dirty water, she didn't go back into the kitchen. She set the bucket on the step, walked around behind the orange trees, and followed the shadow of the wall. She didn't know what she intended to do. She simply kept walking. The carriage house window was on the side wall, about chest high, and there was a light inside. Not the ceiling light, but a table lamp placed in the middle of an old dining table, its dull yellow glow rising toward the ceiling before falling across 2 faces seated opposite each other. Delphine stood about 3 steps from the window in the darkness and looked inside. Camille was sitting with her face toward the window. Across from her sat a man somewhere in his 40s, with salt and pepper hair, thin framed glasses, and a shirt wrinkled at the elbows. At his feet was a leather briefcase worn along the edges, its lid open. Papers covered the table between them. They were spread everywhere, arranged in small stacks, some clipped together, some loose, and at the corner of the table was a much thicker bundle held down by the lamp itself. Neither person touched the other. Neither sat close to the other. Both sat straight, and the distance between them was the distance of 2 people discussing something neither of them liked. The man turned a page, then tapped one fingertip against the paper 3 times, pointing to a particular line. He said something lengthy. Camille shook her head. He tapped the same place again and continued speaking. And this time Camille didn't shake her head. She only looked down. Then she raised her face, and in that position she was looking directly toward the window, with the table lamp shining upward across her features. And she began speaking slowly, the same kind of slow speech Delphine had seen once before on the balcony, the kind used by someone who needed every word to arrive exactly where it was meant to go. Delphine stood perfectly still. She watched the woman's mouth and read 2 complete sentences. He mustn't know. Not before the signature is approved. Then Camille said one more sentence. This one was shorter, and Delphine caught only the ending because halfway through it the woman lifted a hand to move her hair and covered part of her mouth. But what Delphine did catch was a name, a proper name, 2 syllables, spoken clearly and slowly in the yellow light. A name Delphine had never once heard anyone in that house mention. She repeated it silently 3 times to make sure she wasn't inventing it to fill the missing space. The man bent down and wrote something in the margin of the page. Then he raised his head and glanced toward the window once, very quickly, before turning back to the papers in front of him. Delphine stepped backward, followed the shadow of the wall, and retraced her path behind the orange trees. She picked up the bucket from the step and went back into the kitchen. There were people there, 2 kitchen helpers finishing the dishes, and one of them asked why she had been outside so long. She said the faucet in the courtyard was running weak. She washed her hands, hung up her apron, and on the way home that night, she didn't take her usual route. She walked around 2 extra blocks because she needed more time before climbing that iron staircase. She pulled a crumpled laundry receipt from her pocket, the one kind of paper she always happened to have with her, and beneath the streetlight at the corner, she wrote 2 lines on the back. The first was the time. The second was the name. It took Delphine 2 days to decide who she would tell. She couldn't tell Ruthie, because she already knew Ruthie's answer before asking. She couldn't tell anyone in the kitchen, and she understood very clearly that someone like her didn't simply walk up to the master of the house and say something like that. So she chose Otis Grady. He was the only person in that house who had ever nodded to her in greeting out in the courtyard, the only one who had ever stepped aside so she could push her cart through instead of standing still and making her go around him. On Friday morning, she found him in the main garage wiping down the windshield, and she said she wanted to tell him something. Otis set the cloth down. He was 63 years old, had driven for this family for 20 years, and carried the patient expression of a man who had heard many things in his life that he wasn't allowed to repeat. Delphine spoke slowly. She said someone had been going to the old carriage house at night, that there were papers, that she thought something was happening involving the young master's signature. Otis listened without interrupting, both hands braced against the edge of the hood. Then Delphine said what she believed was the most important part, the thing she had repeated to herself over and over for 2 nights so she wouldn't say it wrong. She said there was someone named Rosalie who was holding the papers. Otis straightened so abruptly that she stepped back half a pace. He didn't shout, but his face changed in the way a person's face changes when someone has just said something profane inside a church. He asked her what she had just said. Delphine repeated it. He stood there looking at her for a long time, and she saw his throat move as he swallowed. Then he asked whether she knew who Rosalie was. She said no. He told her Rosalie was the young master's mother. She had died when he was 12 years old. He said it very quietly, and for a long while he said nothing else. Then he told Delphine to go home. He said he didn't know who had told her that name, or where she had picked it up inside that house. But there were some names people didn't bring out and use. He said he would consider this morning something he had never heard. He told her not to mention it to anyone again, because she was standing very close to something she didn't understand, and if anyone got hurt, it would be her, not anyone else. Then he picked up the cloth and went back to wiping the windshield. Delphine remained there for 1 more second, then walked away. She finished her shift that day. She cleaned all 3 floors, changed the towels, emptied the water, hung up her apron, and went home. She didn't stop to greet Odette. She climbed the iron staircase directly to her room, sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, and for the first time since that night outside the carriage house window, she took the crumpled receipt from her pocket and looked at the 2 lines she had written. She thought about Camille's hand lifting to move her hair and covering part of the sentence. She thought about the elderly teacher in Terrebonne, about what the woman had told her on the very first day, that most sounds looked exactly alike on a person's lips, and that anyone who claimed they could read an entire sentence was guessing. Delphine had read that name in dull yellow light, through a glass window, from 3 steps away, and a hand had passed across the middle of the sentence. She sat for a very long time in the darkness, and she was no longer certain. That same morning, Otis drove Elias downtown. He had been driving for about 10 minutes when Elias looked up from his telephone and met his eyes in the rearview mirror. He asked what was bothering him. Otis said nothing was wrong. He said his knee was acting up because of the weather. He said it smoothly, without stumbling, his eyes still fixed on the road, and in 20 years behind the wheel for this family, it was the first time he had ever lied to the man sitting in the back seat. Elias didn't ask again. He didn't ask what the weather was doing to it, didn't ask which knee, didn't mention that Otis had surgery on that knee years ago and had never complained about it once. He simply looked out the window for a while, then said that whenever Otis wanted to tell him, he could tell him. When he finished speaking, he lowered his eyes to his telephone again. Otis kept driving, both hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, and he said nothing for the rest of the journey. The following evening, while Delphine was stacking towels into the cabinet in the first-floor hallway, Camille came down the corridor and stopped at the far end. She didn't call Delphine's name. She simply stood there until Delphine looked up, then smiled and asked whether she was tired. She said she had noticed Delphine staying very late lately. Then she stepped farther into the hallway, sat on the bench against the wall, and lightly patted the empty space beside her as an invitation. Delphine didn't sit. Camille didn't insist. She began speaking in the gentle voice of someone sharing a common concern, saying that times were difficult for women on their own, that she knew a few people who worked in social services and had heard them tell many sad stories. Then she said that sometimes something very small was enough to start everything. One letter sent to the right place, to the right person, and someone opened a file. Then people would ask how many jobs she worked. Then they would draw their own conclusions. And once that file had been opened, no one cared what the truth was anymore. When she finished, Camille sighed, said she was only telling Delphine how the world worked, and that she hoped Delphine slept well. Then she stood and went upstairs. Delphine remained beside the towel cabinet. She knew perfectly well it was a lie. Her daughter slept at Odette's house every night. Delphine worked the night shift, on the small bed beside the window, beneath the blanket printed with whales, with the shell-shaped night light plugged into the outlet near the floor, and her school bag packed for the next morning before darkness even fell. Not one word of what Camille had just said was true, but Delphine knew something else too, something she knew even more clearly than the first thing, that the word of a woman who scrubbed floors would never carry as much weight as the word of a woman about to become mistress of the house, in any room, anywhere in the world. She finished her shift. She left through the back door close to midnight and walked home along her usual route. It wasn't raining, but the pavement was still wet, and she had gone about 3 blocks when she heard a car slowing behind her. It pulled toward the curb, traveled beside her at the same pace for a short distance, then came to a complete stop. The passenger window lowered. The man behind the wheel was the same man she had seen through the carriage house window, with salt and pepper hair, thin framed glasses, and the worn leather briefcase resting on the seat beside him. He didn't get out. He said his name was Grant Holloway, that he knew she had been standing outside the window that night, and that she shouldn't be afraid because if he had wanted to do something to her, he would have done it that same evening. Delphine stood 2 steps from the car and didn't move any closer. He continued in the exhausted voice of a man who had stayed awake through too many nights. He said she left me in Mobile, then in Savannah. You think this time is different. Then he held one hand through the open window. In his palm was a small black USB drive. He said he couldn't give this to anyone else, that his professional license had been suspended, and there was still an unresolved case against him in another state. So if he went to the authorities, they would look at him before they ever looked at her. He said Delphine was different. There was nothing in her life for them to investigate. Delphine took the USB drive. He raised the window and drove away. She stood beneath the streetlight for a while, holding it in her hand, and then she realized she didn't own a computer, never had, and had no idea where she could open something like this in the middle of the night. The next morning, she went to find Otis again. He looked at her, looked at the small object in her hand, and started to say something, then stopped. He led her into the little room beside the garage where an old computer was used to print schedules, and he plugged it in. A long list appeared on the screen. He clicked the first file, and the computer asked for a password. He tried the second, the third, the fourth. Every one of them required a password. He scrolled all the way through the list, and nearly everything was locked. Only one item opened, near the bottom, and it was a photograph. It showed a sheet of paper lying on a table, photographed at a slight angle, but clearly enough to read. It was a marriage certificate issued in the state of South Carolina. On the line to the left was the name Camille Ashford. On the line to the right was the name Grant Holloway. Otis pulled his chair closer to the screen. He searched every corner at the bottom, then examined the back of the document shown in a second photograph, looking for any stamp or notation showing that the marriage had later been dissolved. There was nothing. Otis had told her to let him handle it, that one photograph wasn't enough, that he needed more time and she shouldn't do anything. Delphine had agreed. She had intended to keep her word until that night, the night the entire house was blazing with light and 300 guests filled the ballroom, when she was gathering used napkins from a table placed against the east wall. That table stood directly beneath a wall lamp, and Camille was about 3 steps away, facing the light, speaking to someone hidden behind her shoulder. Delphine hadn't meant to look. She was placing napkins into the basket when she raised her head at the exact moment the woman's mouth moved. Camille was speaking quickly. There was music playing, and a waiter passed between them and blocked Delphine's view for a moment. She caught only 2 fragments. The first was the wedding day. The second, about 1 sentence later, was 4 o'clock. Then Camille turned her head to one side, and the rest disappeared. Delphine stood there with a napkin still in her hand. She didn't know what was going to happen at 4 o'clock on the wedding day. She understood only one thing, and she understood it immediately. The time Otis had asked her for. The time to wait a little longer. To find enough. To become more certain. That time was gone. She placed the napkin into the basket. She pushed the card against the wall and left it there. Then she crossed the floor. Those 11 words were spoken, and the rest of that night moved very quickly. Camille cried more beautifully than anyone Delphine had ever seen cry in her life. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply stood in the middle of the ballroom with one hand covering her mouth, her eyes turning red within seconds as though someone had turned a switch somewhere inside her. And she said she didn't understand, asked what she had ever done to this woman, said that if she had done something wrong, then please just tell her plainly. 300 guests stood in silence. The woman who organized events stepped forward and placed a hand against Camille's back. Someone behind them said, "Dear God, tonight of all nights." And Elias Ferraro stood there in the middle of it all, one hand still holding his glass, and looked Delphine over once from head to toe. He spoke in his ordinary voice, not louder than the music, not lowered into a growl, not fast, not slow. Exactly the same voice he had used when he asked her how many places she worked in the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning. He told her that her employment ended that night. He told her to leave her access card with security and go out through the back entrance. He didn't ask what she had seen. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask her name. Then he turned away and spoke to Otis without lowering his voice, without pulling him aside, simply speaking over his shoulder the way someone gives one last small instruction before returning to his guests, telling him to call Vance Sinclair. Otis stood still for half a second, then nodded. Delphine didn't understand what that name meant. She heard it, stored it in her mind the way she stored everything, and assumed it belonged to a lawyer or a manager, some name that had nothing to do with her. She followed Otis into the service hallway. He said nothing for the entire walk. At the turn in the corridor, Ruthie Fontenot stood holding a stack of towels, and she watched Delphine pass. She didn't step forward. She didn't open her mouth. She only stood there, and Delphine walked past her, and neither woman looked at the other. At the back door, Delphine removed the access card from her collar and handed it to the security guard. Otis walked her all the way to the service gate. When they reached the sidewalk, he stopped, and for a long time he stood there with both hands in his pockets, as though searching for the right words. In the end, he only said that he was sorry. He said he would keep the USB drive. Delphine nodded. She thanked him, and she meant it, then turned away. Behind her, through the large ballroom windows, the music had already started again, and people had begun laughing again, and not one of those 300 guests remembered the face of the woman who had just walked out through the gate. The last of the guests left at around 2 o'clock in the morning. Elias found Camille in the library, sitting on the edge of an armchair with her high heels removed and resting on the floor. He closed the door behind him. He asked whether it was true that she went out to the old carriage house every night. Camille looked up, and she didn't deny a single word. She said yes. Then her face crumpled, and this time she cried in a way entirely different from the way she had cried in the ballroom. crying like someone who had finally been released from a band tightened around her chest for months. And she said she had prayed that he would never ask that question, and had also prayed that he would. She stood, walked to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and took out a file held inside a stiff cover. She placed it in front of him. The man who came to the carriage house every night was named Grant Holloway, an attorney who specialized in non-profit foundations whom she had hired from out of state, deliberately from out of state so no one in this city would know. What they had been doing for the past several months was establishing a scholarship fund. The fund was for the children of service workers in New Orleans, children whose parents cleaned hotel rooms, washed dishes in restaurant kitchens, scrubbed floors at night. Camille turned to the first page. At the top, printed in sharp black ink, was the name of the foundation, the Rosalie Ferraro Foundation. Elias didn't touch the papers. He only looked down at that name. Camille continued, her voice still catching, saying that she had learned everything she could about his mother, that she knew how many years Rosalie had cleaned rooms at a downtown hotel before his father became successful, that she knew Rosalie had died when Elias was still young. She said she had never dared ask him about his mother, because every time anyone mentioned her, he changed the subject within a single sentence. So she didn't ask. She did all of this on her own. She said she intended to give it to him on their wedding day, in front of everyone who had watched him grow up, so that name could be spoken aloud inside this house one more time. Then she said the final thing, and she said it very softly. She said that was why he wasn't supposed to know. Elias sat down. He went through the file slowly, one page at a time. The foundation charter, the state registration, the proposed board of directors, a draft of the scholarship eligibility criteria several pages long. There was also a small separate folder clipped inside, containing a copy of the old personnel records she had managed to obtain from the hotel, yellowed papers bearing his mother's name. He stopped on that page for a very long time. Nothing in the file was false. Every seal was real. Elias closed the folder. He sat in silence for a while, then said he was sorry. He said he had allowed a stranger to stand in front of him and speak 11 words into his ear, and he had believed them before he even thought to ask Camille a single question. Camille shook her head and said the fault was hers, that she should have told him from the beginning, that she had tried to keep something good hidden, and secrets always looked the same from the outside, no matter what was inside them. She sat beside him and rested her head against his shoulder. Elias raised a hand and took hers. At the far end of the library, near the door leading into the service hallway, Otis Grady stood holding the car keys. He had been there since the moment Camille opened the drawer, and a cold feeling moved down his spine, because the name printed on that page, the name no one in this house had revealed until tonight, was a name he had already heard. He had heard it days earlier, outside the garage, from the mouth of a woman who scrubbed floors, the woman he had just sent away. Vance Sinclair was the contractor behind nearly every service company in the Garden District, and half the restaurants along the main avenue, a name everyone who sat at the same table as Elias Ferraro knew, and everyone who scrubbed their floors did not. On Monday morning, the owner of the laundry on Claiborne Avenue called Delphine over beside the press and told her they had to cut back her shifts that week. She didn't look Delphine in the eye when she said it. On Tuesday afternoon, the manager of the restaurant sent her a message, saying they already had enough people scheduled for the weekend. By Tuesday evening, Delphine called the service company that had placed her at the estate and asked whether there was work anywhere else, and the operator left her waiting on the line a little longer than necessary before coming back to say they didn't have anything suitable at the moment. No one explained why. No one mentioned that night. In 2 days, all 3 of Delphine's jobs disappeared, and it was the way they disappeared that made her understand that the name she had heard over that man's shoulder wasn't the name of an attorney. On Wednesday, the landlord taped a notice to her door. On Friday, another letter arrived from the hospital, and this time they didn't say the surgery had been postponed. They wrote that because the family's financial records no longer met the eligibility requirements, the funded placement had been reassigned to another patient on the waiting list. Delphine read that letter while standing at the bottom of the iron staircase in broad daylight, then folded it and went inside to greet Odette as she always did. That night she didn't sleep. Close to 4 o'clock in the morning, she went outside and sat on the top step of the iron staircase, with both arms wrapped around her knees. The sky was still dark, with only the yellow light from the tire repair shop sign spilling upward, and there was no one on the street. She had gone through her husband's funeral without crying in front of anyone. She had gone through those 2 years by getting up every morning and continuing to work. But that night, Sitting on the iron step, she allowed herself to cry. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders shaking in waves, her face buried against her knees. She didn't hear the screen door downstairs open. She only knew someone had come when she felt a small weight settle onto the step beside her. Josie was wearing her pajamas, barefoot, her hair tangled to one side. The little girl didn't ask anything. She only pressed herself close against her mother, then lifted both hands and placed both palms against Delphine's chest, the way she had done all her life to listen to other people, the way she listened to Odette singing in the kitchen, listened to her mother's laughter, listened to the sewing machine running downstairs. She left her hands there for a while, her head tilted slightly, her face concentrated like someone trying to tune a radio. Then she pulled her hands back and signed. "Mom, are you singing?" Delphine lifted her head and looked at her daughter. Then she laughed. She laughed while the tears were still running, the sound breaking between two breaths, and she shook her head, then nodded because she didn't know how else to answer. Josie frowned, placed her hand against her mother's chest again, held it there longer, then pulled it away and signed that this song was too sad and Mom should sing a different one. Delphine wiped her face with one hand. She signed that Mom didn't know another song. Josie signed back that yes, she did, the one Mom always sang while washing her hair, and the little girl lifted both hands and patted them together in some rhythm only she could hear, then looked at her mother and waited. Delphine sat still. Then she sang. She sang softly, the old song she always sang while rinsing water through her daughter's hair, and she sang while the little girl pressed both palms against her chest so she could catch every vibration. Josie nodded with satisfaction. She signed that this song was better. Then she stood, took her mother by the wrist, and pulled. She pulled Delphine down the stairs, through the screen door, and into the back room where the shell-shaped nightlight was still plugged into the outlet near the floor. She climbed onto the little bed beside the window, lifted the whale-patterned blanket, and patted the empty space beside her with the expression of someone who wouldn't accept refusal. Delphine lay down. The bed was too short for her, her feet extending beyond the end, and the little girl had to roll close against the wall to make enough room. Josie pulled the blanket over both of them, then placed one hand against her mother's chest and left it there. Outside, the sky was beginning to brighten. Otis Grady began with the only thing he had, the name on the photograph. He didn't use anyone connected to the family. He called an old acquaintance in Baton Rouge, a man who had once worked as an investigator for an insurance company and now made his living finding people, and Otis paid him out of his own pocket. 3 days later, a thin stack of printed pages arrived in a brown envelope. Grant Holloway was indeed a lawyer, or at least he had been. His license to practice law in South Carolina had been suspended, and there was still an unresolved civil case in Alabama, the kind of case that would find him automatically the moment his name appeared on any hotel guest list or rental agreement. Otis sat for a very long time with that sheet of paper resting on his lap. Then he understood what he had been staring directly at for weeks without seeing. This man couldn't rent a hotel room in New Orleans. He couldn't put his name on an apartment lease. He couldn't sit for long in any familiar restaurant in a city where the Ferraro family had eyes and ears on nearly every street. If he stayed anywhere else in the city, someone connected to the Ferraros would know within days. The only safe place for him, the only place no one would think to search, was inside Elias's own gates. Camille hadn't been reckless by allowing him to come and go from the old carriage house every night. She had been playing the boldest move someone in her position could possibly play, and she had played it in the middle of her opponent's own yard. Otis kept reading until he reached the final section, the part listing the places where those two names had appeared together on official documents. Charleston, Savannah, Mobile. 3 cities, 3 times, each separated by several years, and every time it ended with a foundation or a company being created and then quietly dissolved. When he reached that point, he stood to pour himself a glass of water, then remained by the sink for a long time without remembering to turn on the faucet. The last thing he discovered wasn't inside any envelope. It was inside his own memory. He sat down, took out paper and a pen, and wrote down the point in time when Camille Ashford had entered Elias's life, the gallery exhibition in the French Quarter. Then he compared it with the date in the file, the date the company in Mobile had been dissolved. Less than 4 months separated the two. That woman had left Mobile and gone directly to New Orleans, and he remembered, as clearly as though it had happened the day before, that the person who had brought Elias to that exhibition hadn't been a friend, hadn't been a client, hadn't been chance. Otis had driven the car. He had sat outside in it for the entire evening, and the person in the back seat with Elias on the way there had been Emmett Ferraro. That evening, after driving Elias home, Otis didn't pull the car into the garage the way he usually did. He shut off the engine in the courtyard, followed Elias all the way into the library, and stood in the middle of the room until Elias finally looked up and asked what was wrong. Otis pulled out a chair and sat down, something he had never done in that room before. He placed the printed file on the table. Then he said that before you read this, I need to tell you something, and I've been carrying it for 20 years. Elias didn't touch the papers. Otis said that when your father was still alive, there were nights when he told me to drive him to a small office near Chupatula Street, sometimes to Metairie, sometimes farther away. Every time, he told me to wait. So I waited. Once, I waited for 3 hours. I saw other people go inside, people whose faces I knew and whose professions I knew. I saw papers carried in and carried out, and there was one name I heard often enough to remember, even though no one ever said it directly to me. That name was Halcyon Ridge. He paused. Then he said that I never asked questions. Not once. I sat outside in the car, turned on the radio, and waited until he came back out. I told myself it wasn't my business, that a driver's only job was to drive, and I told myself that for 20 years until it became the truth. He raised his eyes to Elias. He said, I've been silent for most of your life, Mr. Elias, and now I'm old, and I don't have much left to lose except the seat behind the wheel. So read it. The wedding day arrived on a Saturday near the end of the month, and Delphine learned about it from the local newspaper Odette always bought at the corner, from a small notice on an inside page stating that the Ferraro family wedding would be held at the private residence. She read that line over breakfast. She looked at the clock on the wall of Odette's kitchen. Then she stood. She didn't have a car. Her telephone had been disconnected the previous week because she hadn't paid the bill. Her name no longer appeared on any list at that house, and her access card had been sitting in a drawer at the security desk since the night the month before. The only things she had were the paper inside the tin box, and the old service uniform the agency had never asked her to return, washed clean and folded inside her closet. She put it on. She told Odette she had something she needed to do, and Odette looked her over once and only said to be careful. Walking from the 9th Ward to the Garden District took more than 2 hours. She followed the avenue, passing through neighborhoods where the fronts of the houses grew wider with every mile, and she kept track of the time inside her head the entire way. By the time she reached the service gate behind the estate, it was after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Music was already playing beyond the fence. 2 security guards stood at the gate, and a table had been placed across the entrance, with a guest list resting on top. The younger guard ran his pen down the page, asked her name, checked again, then said it wasn't there. Delphine told him she had worked at the house since spring. He said that today only people whose names appeared on the list were allowed inside, no exceptions. And he said it in the voice of someone who had repeated the same sentence 30 times that morning. She stood there. She asked him what time it was. He said 3:20. Then footsteps sounded on the gravel path. Emmett Ferraro came out from inside, his suit jacket buttoned, an unlit cigarette held between 2 fingers. He stopped several steps from the table and looked at Delphine. His eyes moved from her worn heels to the uniform, then to her face, and he looked longer than necessary, the look of a man comparing what he saw with something stored in memory. Then he asked the 2 guards what was going on. The younger guard said this woman wasn't on the list. Emmett nodded slowly. He lit the cigarette, took one drag, and said to let her in. The guard hesitated and said, "Sir, the list." Emmett said he knew. Let her through, and if there was a problem, he would take responsibility. He said it as easily as though he were asking someone to bring him a glass. The guard moved the table aside. Delphine stepped through the gate. As she passed Emmett, he lightly touched her elbow, not holding her, only enough to make her pause for half a step. He leaned down slightly and said, in the same mild conversational voice that she shouldn't misunderstand, "I'm not helping you. I'm only opening the door. You're the one walking through it." Then he stepped back, tipped his head toward the kitchen entrance, and turned away to finish his cigarette. Inside, the house was so crowded that it hardly looked like the same place. 400 guests filled the south garden where the wedding platform had been built. While inside, servers moved constantly between the kitchen and the rows of banquet tables already prepared. Delphine took a tray from the rack near the kitchen door, placed several empty glasses on it, and started walking. She moved through the service corridor, past the rear hall, and into the main foyer where guests stood in clusters with glasses of wine in their hands. She kept close to the wall the way she always had. Someone stepped back to let her pass without looking up. Someone else continued talking while placing an empty glass on the tray she carried, then returned to the conversation without missing a beat. One man stood directly in her path, and when she said "excuse me," he shifted aside while keeping his eyes on the person he was speaking to. Not one of those 400 guests looked at her face. She passed the foot of the marble staircase, turned into the east hallway, and stopped outside the library door. Voices could be heard speaking on the other side. She looked at the clock hanging at the far end of the hallway. 3:52 in the afternoon. The library door wasn't locked. Delphine set the tray down on the cabinet in the hallway and pushed the door open. There were 4 people inside. Camille stood beside the desk in her wedding dress, still holding the veil she had taken off. Grant Holloway sat in the chair opposite with his leather briefcase open at his feet. Another man Delphine had never seen before stood at the far end of the table holding a thick stack of papers. And Elias Ferraro sat in the middle, wearing his wedding suit, an uncapped pen in his right hand, the tip hovering about the width of a finger joint above the page. All 4 of them turned to look at her. Camille opened her mouth and said something about calling security. Delphine didn't listen. She walked straight to the table. She didn't shout. She didn't say a single word. She reached into the pocket of her service uniform and took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, its edges yellow with age, opened it with both hands on the tabletop, and pushed it beside his pen. Then she stepped back once and stood still. Elias looked down. The paper was a loan agreement. At the top was the address of a house in Homa. On the borrower line was a name he had never heard before, Aaron J. Aubrey, and beneath it was a slanted signature, the handwriting of a man who wasn't accustomed to holding a pen. Elias skimmed the terms. Then his eyes stopped on the lender line. Halcyon Ridge Partners. He looked up at Camille for exactly half a second. She was staring at the paper, and something on her face had collapsed and rebuilt itself so quickly that anyone else might have missed it. He lowered his eyes again, and then his gaze moved to the very bottom line, printed smaller than everything else, the line naming the guarantor, Rosalie Holdings. The pen in Elias's hand became still. Inside his mind, everything arrived at once, and it arrived fast. His father. Those nights at the office near Chupatula Street while Otis sat outside in the car waiting for 3 hours. The lending network that had stretched along the coast throughout the years Elias was still in school. The money that had paid his tuition. The money that had built half the empire he was now sitting inside. And the name his father had used to guarantee all of it, not his own name, but the name of the woman who had cleaned hotel rooms for 14 years and had been in the ground since Elias was 12. His father had put her name there. He had signed his wife's name beneath every paper like this one. And papers like this had found their way into the homes of men like Aaron Aubrey. Then the second blow landed in the same breath, before Elias had even managed to exhale. The Rosalie Ferraro Foundation. The name printed in sharp black ink across the first page of the file Camille had placed in front of him in this very room that night, after all the guests had gone. She had said she researched his mother. She had said she obtained old personnel records from the hotel. She had said she wanted that name spoken aloud inside this house one more time. She hadn't found that name in anyone's memory. She had taken it from this very set of records. She had known about Rosalie Holdings before she ever knew him, and she had chosen the one name in the world Elias would never question, never investigate, never have the courage to look directly at, then placed it across the first page of a file and pushed it toward him on the night he was weakest. He looked up. Camille was speaking. She was saying that this woman had been fired, that she had told him from the beginning something wasn't right, that now wasn't the time, that 400 people were waiting outside. Her voice was still beautiful. Its rhythm was still perfect. Grant Holloway said nothing. He had sunk lower into his chair and was staring down at the leather briefcase by his feet. Elias looked once more at the yellowed paper. Then he capped the pen. He did it slowly, and the small click of the cap locking into place was clearly audible in the room. He set it down on the table beside the unsigned documents. Then he stood. He didn't look at Camille. He looked at Delphine, the woman in the service uniform standing one step from the table with both arms hanging at her sides, who hadn't spoken a single word since entering the room. He looked at her longer than all the times he had ever passed her in the hallway put together. Then he picked up the yellowed paper, folded it back into quarters along its old creases, and walked toward the door. Elias walked through the foyer, out into the south garden, and stepped onto the wedding platform. The master of ceremonies was holding the microphone and beginning the welcome remarks, and Elias reached out and took it from him. 400 guests looked up. The music stopped. In the front row, 13 members of the family council sat side by side, and Emmett was at the end of the row, with both hands resting on his knees. Elias offered no words of thanks. He said that a woman had just entered my house through the service gate, and her name is Delphine Aubrey. He said that she had been scrubbing the floors of my house since spring. Then he said that I have never once asked her name. After saying that, he stood in silence for several seconds. Then he opened the paper, folded into quarters in his hand, and read aloud. He read the name of the borrower. He read the address of the house in Homa. He read the lender line, Halcyon Ridge Partners. Then he read the guarantor line, and he read more slowly, and when the name Rosalie Holdings came through the speaker mounted on the post, a very small sound moved through the garden, the sound of 400 people drawing breath at the same time. Some of the people in the front row needed no explanation. Mr. Bertrand set down his glass. Mrs. Marguerite turned to look at the person beside her. Elias continued, and he kept it brief. He said that my father put my mother's name on these papers. He said that the man who signed on the line below died, trying to repay all of this money. He said that the wedding today will not take place, and I apologize to everyone for making you travel such a long way. Camille stood in the aisle beside the platform, still holding her veil in one hand. She had no time to do anything. There were no tears, no hand rising to cover her mouth, none of that gentle voice of someone trying not to make a scene. She only stood there, then turned her head and looked toward the far end of the garden, where Delphine stood in her service uniform between 2 rows of banquet tables, holding nothing in her hands. Camille looked directly into that woman's face. It was the first time she had truly seen her. Delphine raised her head. She didn't lower her eyes, didn't move toward the wall, didn't search for the bucket at her feet. She looked straight back, and she held that gaze until Camille was the one who turned away. At the kitchen door, Ruthie Fontenot stood with a stack of plates in her hands, and she too had raised her head, and she watched the garden from beginning to end without lowering her eyes once. Emmett Ferraro stood before Elias had even stepped down from the platform. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned to the 12 people seated around him and said that under the family charter, when the head of the family publicly repudiated the foundation of the family's wealth in front of outsiders, any member had the right to demand an immediate vote. He said that he was making that demand. The vote took place in the large dining room behind closed doors less than half an hour later, while people outside in the garden were still folding the chairs. 6 voted to keep Elias. 6 voted to remove him. The only person who had not yet voted was Otis Grady, a man who had never held a seat on that council during his 20 years with the family, and whom Elias's father had given a voting share during the final year of his life, like a gift he never imagined anyone would actually use. Otis stood. He said that I have driven for 2 men in this family. He said that your father never let me sit at the table. You did. Then he sat down and cast his vote to keep Elias. Elias kept his seat, but 7 of those 13 people rose and walked out of the room that same afternoon, and they took the port division with them, took the warehouses, took the fleet of trucks, took most of what his father had spent 30 years building. By the end of the week, less than half of the empire Elias had inherited remained. Otis stood in the dining room doorway, after everyone had gone, and said that your father spent 30 years building that place. Elias looked out into the empty hallway, and said that I know. Otis's thin printed file, together with the photograph of the South Carolina marriage certificate, and the complete records from the 3 cases in Charleston, Savannah, and Mobile, was turned over by the family attorney to the federal prosecutor's office on Monday morning. Grant Holloway cooperated from the very first interview. As for the Halcyon Ridge files, Elias didn't give them to anyone. He kept them. He had something else he needed to do with them. The foundation bearing Rosalie's name was established again that autumn, this time with a real board of directors, real audits, and a list of students that anyone could look up. Elias didn't hand Delphine a position. He invited her to sit at the negotiating table, and she negotiated her salary so firmly that his attorney had to ask for a break. She accepted the job of coordinating applications, and she enrolled in evening classes at the community college downtown 3 nights a week after Josie had gone to sleep. The Halcyon Ridge files were reopened as well. The list of families who had signed papers like Aaron's was longer than Delphine had imagined. When Elias asked where she wanted to begin, She looked down at the list for a while and said that her husband no longer needed that boat, but the people whose names were still on this page still needed their homes. Josie's surgery took place that winter, and they had to wait several more weeks before the device could be activated. That day she was 7 years old, sitting in a plastic chair in the clinic, with both legs swinging above the floor. The technician was a young woman who sat in front of her and explained every step in sign language, and Josie nodded with the solemn expression of someone supervising another person's work. Then the young woman switched the device on. Josie jolted. She sat completely still for 2 seconds, eyes wide, then whipped her head toward her mother with the suspicious expression of someone who thought she had just been tricked. The technician crumpled a sheet of paper in her hand. Josie turned toward the sound, then burst out laughing. She laughed so loudly that the sound filled the clinic, and she immediately reached out and demanded the paper for herself. She crumpled it. Then she crumpled it again. She tapped her fingers against the tabletop and tilted her head to listen. She clapped once and laughed. For nearly 10 minutes, she refused to let anyone speak to her because she was too busy testing every object within reach. Delphine sat in the chair beside her and opened the cloth bag resting on her lap. Inside was the tin box. She lifted the lid and took out the tape from the upper right corner, the only one with a strip of paper attached to the side that carried no date. Only one line written in that familiar slanted handwriting. She placed it inside the old handheld recorder Aaron used to carry to the docks, then connected the recorder to Josie's device exactly the way she had carefully asked the doctor how to do the week before. When Josie saw her mother doing something, she stopped playing with the paper. She looked at the recorder. Then she looked at her mother. Delphine signed that she should listen. Then she pressed the button. No one else in the clinic heard anything. Only Josie did. The little girl sat perfectly straight in the chair. Her eyes weren't focused on anything, the look of someone pouring every part of herself into her ears. Then her face began to change. She heard a man's voice. The voice said, "Hello, baby girl. It's Dad." The voice said that he didn't know how old she would be when she heard this, that she was probably grown by then, probably taller than their kitchen table. The voice said that the wind was strong at the docks that day, and that he had finished building the bow of Mr. Thibodeau's boat, and that he had thought about her all afternoon. The voice said that he had been talking to her since before she knew he was speaking, and that he would keep talking that way until the day she could hear him. The voice told her to be good. Then it stopped. Josie remained motionless for a long time after the tape had ended. She turned toward her mother. Her hands rose, and they were trembling so badly that the first sign came out wrong and she had to do it again. "Dad, talk to me." Delphine nodded. Josie signed it again, more slowly this time, more firmly, as though she needed to nail the words into the air. "Dad, talk to me." Then she asked whether there were more. Delphine lifted the tin box so her daughter could see inside. See the 2 neat rows of tapes, each one carrying a small strip of paper with a date written in that slanted handwriting. Josie looked down, then reached out with one finger and touched the first tape very gently, as though she were afraid she might damage it. Elias stood at the far end of the clinic holding his coat, and he turned his face toward the window. He remained that way for a while. Then he walked over, bent down until he was level with the little girl, and asked Delphine how to sign thank you. She showed him. He did it wrong. He did it wrong a second time, and Josie laughed uncontrollably, then took those large hands in her own and patiently shaped them into the correct position like a teacher who had worked with many slow students before. The third time, he got it right. There is one thing this story leaves behind, and it is very simple. People lie most comfortably in front of those they don't consider fully human. A person's dignity has never been measured by the work they do to survive, but by whether they have the courage to stand upright when they know the truth, even when standing upright may cost them everything. And for those who hold a great deal in their hands, the lesson comes down to only 3 words. Ask their name. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that each day more meaningful stories can find their way to you. How did today's story make you feel? Please leave a few words in the comments, because we truly want to hear the deepest feelings in your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, peaceful lives, and joy in every passing day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.